The following podcast contains spoilers for the film Silence of the Lambs and Psycho. Also, it's just generally an icky movie. It contains a lot of transphobia and depicts a lot of misogyny, so listener discretion is advised. Hello, Heather.
Hello, Mattie.
I had a little offer for you today, something a little bit different for our listeners. Quid pro quo, a full psychological profile on the two of us, the hostesses of the DVD Clutter podcast.
Okay. Quid pro quo. What?
Just do your job, but never forget what he is.
Oh, he's a monster. Pure psychopath. So rare to capture one alive.
So close to the way you're going to catch him. Do you realize that? Oh, Clarice, your problem is you need to get more fun out of life.
So, today we are talking about a little film from back in the day, 1991, called Silence of the Lambs. Heather, what is Silence of the Lambs, and what's your relationship to this film?
Silence of the Lambs is the story of a young FBI trainee named Clarice Starling, played by Jodie Foster, who goes on assignment to interview a very well-known serial killer named Hannibal the Cannibal, played by Anthony Hopkins. And they are working together, I would say sort of working together, to catch a serial killer named Buffalo Bill. And for me, this movie was one that my parents actually showed me for the first time. They were really excited to show me this movie when I came of age to, be able to see it. And it was kind of a rite of passage movie for me. And also, really, I think the first thriller that I watched, a movie that's not just straight up horror. I think, there's obviously this is a psychological thriller. And so for me, this just became kind of that staple movie. I mean, I loved it from the first time I saw it, and, got to share that experience with my parents. And, I know they were kind of excited when some of the sequels came out and we could go see those together later on. So this has kind of just been one of those movies that's been with me since I was probably like 12 or 13 years old.
Yeah, my story with it is probably very similar, except that I remember going to like a thrift store when I was young and finding the book. And, I always felt like when I was at that age, around 10 to 14, I felt it felt really important that I read really thick trade paperback books so that like I can show off how much of an adult I am. And so, I actually read the book first.
Okay.
And both had a really big impact on me at a young age, for some of which for reasons that we'll probably get into in a little bit. But yeah, it was definitely a film that both of my parents really admired and enjoyed and, talked up a lot before I got around to seeing it. And, sort of it was one of those films that it was like such a phenomenon in the 90s. It was constantly being parodied, even in like children's media and things like that. The idea of, that Anthony Hopkins performance as Hannibal Lecter, just really kind of all-encompassing at the time. And I eventually owned it on VHS and probably watched it enough to break the tape, I'm sure, and it really, held a very strong impact over me at a young age. What do you think of watching it now? We just finished it.
I loved it again. I have to say, I've seen it probably almost 10 times at this point in my life. And there were still parts that I was surprised by. I was still on the edge of my seat. I still found so many things just from the filmmaking perspective to really enjoy. And I really love Jodie Foster's performance in this movie.
Definitely. I feel like when I was young, I really appreciated, sort of like the campy big performance of Anthony Hopkins. But the older I get, the more I appreciate Jodie Foster's performance and, that sort of trying to navigate these very tense, vulnerable situations, not just with the serial killers and like the horrible, like, the toxic figures that she's encountering, but even the people that she's working with, the people that are supposed to be her allies, and the way that the film uses these point of view shots repeatedly where you're just very tight on people's faces as they're looking right into the camera lens and saying things in like really kind of a deconstruction, I think, of like a lot of like male gaze in filmmaking specifically, and you just feel very exposed and like horrified.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest thing I took away from this rewatch was where you're talking about the male gaze, sort of the perspective of her being a woman in a very male-dominated field, and not just within her field, but everywhere, everywhere Clarice goes, she is somehow either hit on or, she's looked at like she is, not as intelligent as all the men around her. It's everywhere she goes, you feel that sort of claustrophobic feeling.
And it gets kind of like confused a little bit too, because she is very much, she's still a student and she's surrounded by these professionals. So she's very young in addition to being a woman. And it's like breaking down like how much of this is actually like just, people talking down to her because she deserves to be talked down to because she's still ignorant of so much that she's going to need to know, versus how much of it is she's being talked down to because of who she is. And it's like it's going back and watching a lot of these films. We definitely get the sense of like women are not always viewed as people in a lot of the films that we grew up with, and this is like such an incredible change of pace from that, I feel like.
Yeah, and especially for the time, I think that Clarice is just a really well thought out character who has so much nuance, and Jodie Foster plays her with equal parts, I think, compassion, and also she is really commanding in what she's doing as an FBI agent. And I believe her as both a compassionate person and a person who is, able to track down this serial killer. And I think that also in this movie, I think what makes it works for me is because, we have the character of Jack Crawford, who is really actually very supportive of Clarice. He's not hitting on her. He's not, he's just sort of, he sees something in her and he is just supporting that. But he's also letting her take a leading role in the case, which I think is really important.
I find Crawford to be a really fascinating and complicated character because on one hand it's like, yes, he does sort of come across as very supportive and very like, very much taking a mentorship role and in some ways trying to protect her, sometimes to a fault, but he's also very manipulative of her. He's not giving her all the information that she needs going forward. And, I kind of feel like a lot of his encouragement really comes out of, just wanting what she can get for him. And a lot of it is, I think that Hannibal's read on it is not entirely wrong. Like, I think that, or I guess it was Chilton actually who brought him up, and you want to talk about another creep in the film,
so
Chilton. But like the idea that like she's selected not so much because of her skills, but because she is quote unquote to Lecter's taste, that she is there as like that there's like a chess match going on between Crawford and Lecter. And as much as we are centered on Foster, in a lot of ways, she's more of a pawn in that situation than like the king or queen. Yeah.
You know what? I didn't really think of it that way, but you bringing that up, definitely, I can certainly see that. And I think that, it's really interesting, the dynamic there with Lecter and Clarice, because like you said, clearly Lecter, can pick up on these things and sees, the ways in which he's being manipulated and also the ways in which she's being manipulated. And he kind of uses that to his advantage because he plays upon those fears that she might already have being in this male-dominated space. And then he's saying, well, are you here because you really, have the skill set to interview, or are you here because Crawford has a crush on you? All this kind of stuff. And he's really getting in her head. And it plays really interesting, in terms of the feminist kind of themes in the movie, I think.
And speaking of the feminist themes in the movie, this is also talking about the meaning that it had for us growing up. One of the big impacts that it had on me was that it was one of the few pop culture pieces of art, pieces of work that really openly discussed transsexuality. The reason that I brought it up now for the podcast was because recently, probably over a month now, because our show was delayed, but Ted Levine disowned his performance as Jamie Gum, and basically felt that it was hurtful to the trans community. And watching it this time, it's like, yeah, you kind of have a point, but also I'm like, I don't know how much of that really rests on your shoulders as an actor. I mean, you chose to take the role, and it's always kind of a loaded issue whether cis people play, when cis people play trans people in film. It creates a public perception that's a problem, and took a long time to really get trans actors into those roles. But I think for me, it was like every time the discussion of transsexuality and trans identities is brought up in this film, I feel like the film just grinds to a halt for me.
Our Billy wasn't born a criminal, Clarice. He was made one through years of systematic abuse. Billy hates his own identity, you see, and he thinks that makes him a transsexual. But his pathology is 1,000 times more savage and more terrifying.
How did that feel for you?
Yeah, I didn't feel like it was really saying anything about the character of, because at the end of the movie, I still don't really know what to think about this character. I feel like the movie is sort of trying to say two things at once, where on the one hand, they're saying, well, this person went to get gender affirming care but was denied, and so therefore it's a systemic problem that, they are the way they are. And I'm like, I don't know, is that, it's saying like, well, the person couldn't get care, so therefore they turned into a serial killer. It's like, okay, on the one hand, you seem like you're kind of, you're having the conversation about gender affirming care in this movie, but on the other hand, you're saying because it's not available that made this person,
So there is a long history of how the medical establishment has viewed transgender and transsexual identities. I had actually done a lot of research coming into this episode to sort of remind myself of the question of homosexual transsexuality versus autogynephilia. And, watching the film, I'm like, no, the film is not even that interested in it. I think the book, I remember it being more so, but that also could be colored by the fact that, this was some of the most robust information that I had at the time. Mainly the way that I view it in terms of what it's saying about transsexuality is that it's looking at the character of Buffalo Bill, of Jamie Gum, as another example of men coveting women and men wanting the bodies of women, and in this case being a literal interpretation of that, a literal expression of that. It plays into so many of the themes of the film. It does so in a way that certainly does sort of inform when it's the best picture winner of the year that it came out, when it's a huge blockbuster film from the director of the Talking Heads film Stop Making Sense. It's a huge hit. It was a huge property, big stars in it. And this is the biggest source of information that so many people, including myself, had about trans people for the longest time.
I mean, I never saw any character like that in a movie up until that point, and I think as a kid watching it, the infamous scene that's in the movie, I was like, I don't even know what that means. I don't know what that represents, because I had never seen anything like that, on screen. And I think watching it this time, I felt like, well, we really could have just left this idea of this character being trans just out of the movie, and just had they are a serial killer. They are making this suit of skin, creepy enough. Why did we have to bring in the fact that, the character is trans, but also, again, we're not saying anything
I think it's kind of playing a little bit into that, the kind of the psycho trope. You have you like to get into the heads of serial killers, but I think the difference, and the reason that I still really like Psycho, as problematic as that was the first time that people connected fear of trans people with bathroom access. Was the shower scene in Psycho. That's the origination of it all. But Psycho at least takes the time to sort of understand this character's experience. We sort of understand, like, at the end of the film when they say Norman Bates is not a transvestite, we get what they mean by that.
Right.
Here they're saying, Jamie Gumb is not really a transsexual because they just hate their identity and they want to be a transsexual. And I'm like, well, what is the distinction between wanting to be a transsexual and being a transsexual? And it feels like, again, it's cis people sort of, like, you read a thing like, oh, there are people who get sex change surgeries, and isn't that a weird, creepy thing? And we're just going to put it in the movie.
Right, exactly. And I don't think it serves the movie. It's hard because there is, this is something I struggle with as just a fan of horror. There's a long history of, anti-transness in horror, and, using a trans person to represent a socially deviant person in some kind of way.
I mean, we went up against this when we talked about Let Me In. It was the same sort of thing in terms of the trans coding of that main vampire character.
Because to me, a lot of this, as I'm watching it, like I said, we could have just left this out and it wouldn't have really changed. The story would have been just, it would have been creepy. The character is creepy enough. We don't need to, like, add in this thing that has nothing to do with with this character, really. I don't, and obviously the character is informed by, Ed Gein and Ted Bundy.
And from what I understand, myths about Ed Gein that were not even true.
Well, exactly. And that was another thing I was going to sort of bring up, is that, we're just perpetuating this, myth about a lot of these, this kind of behavior, and we're somehow tying it to transness when it really has no basis in fact.
And Ted Bundy very much not trans.
No, Ted Bundy not trans, but there are a lot of things directly
you would be
lifted
hard pressed to make that mistake of Ted Bundy as a trans woman.
I think that the movie does a really good job of portraying the Buffalo Bill character as, every time we're in his space, it feels like grimy and dirty and just like this labyrinth of rooms. And, you just feel this grossness, I feel like, whenever we're with him. And that is completely devoid of the...
In fairness, a lot of trans people have, like, severe ADHD and are not good about cleaning up after themselves. Like, I can say this from experience,
But, so I want to also, I want to say that the movie is effective in creating this, character outside of that. But it's unfortunate that they tie it to transness.
I think that the issue that I have is that the film is not effective of creating that character, regardless of how it views their gender identity, their perception of their own sexuality, and, their own body. Buffalo Bill as a character feels very thin to me, that we don't really get a sense of what drives them. We don't get a sense of who they are, like what are their wants and their needs, what are their purposes. This is not like something where I think trans people are a monolith on that character. I look at them now and I see, like, I just see stereotypes. I just see the disgust that cis people see for us. And there are other people, they look at the Q Lazarus dancing scene and they're like, get it, girl, like, and we sort of have that with, like, a lot of serial killers where, like, we know these are not people that we want to admire.
Right.
Like, you and I can crush over Lestat and also think that, you probably shouldn't be killing people and sucking their blood.
Yeah,
and, like,
he's toxic as fuck. Let me ask you, because you read the book, so do we get any further insight into that character in the book?
As I recall, it's a lot more of the same, but it's been a long time. There's a lot more time spent on that character, but I don't feel like I don't feel like we really get a good sense of them, and I don't get the sense that like Thomas Harris did any sort of research. I mean, he did his research in terms of like his medical research. He did his research talking to psychologists and doctors, and there's a lot of time spent on that and on like that attempt to sort of distinguish Buffalo Bill from the actual trans community by saying that we're all very passive.
Our belly wants to change too.
There's no correlation in the literature between transsexualism and violence. Transsexuals are very passive.
What are your thoughts? Am I very passive?
That line, I was like, what are they even? It's just like, okay, like there is one way that a trans person could be. So clearly, everybody's passive. Yeah. So clearly, it's a very the movie's very. It doesn't do a good job. It does not do a good job with that. I think the problem also is like the star of the show here is Hannibal Lecter, and I don't think that like the time is necessarily.
Hannibal Lecter could be a fucking trans icon,
I don't know that the time is really given to the Buffalo Bill character because really the movie is about the relationship between Clarice and Lecter. So I think that that's also kind of a failing of just. It's just the material itself is not as interested because the story is not exactly about. We're not just solving this case of Buffalo Bill. It's really more concerned about, this dynamic here between the, Lecter and
it's a creepy dynamic because and it's something that I think a lot of us can relate to where it's like, you meet somebody who, just wants to push past your boundaries and like knows that you're not in a position to say no.
Yeah.
And that comes across so well, but also it's like, wow, this is also the only character in the movie who actively listens to her.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because Jodie Foster does such a great job being equal parts disgusted and also a tiny bit charmed by him. Mm-hmm. She is kind of under his spell a little bit,
Yeah.
And she could just say, no, I'm not answering your questions. No, I'm not talking about myself. But also she kind of thinks, well, this is a way for me to get what I want. So I will share that. And in doing so, she's very manipulated by him.
And I think she also wants to test herself. She wants to see if she can outwit him. She wants to believe that she can prove that she's smarter. She wants to show that she's ready for the big leagues in that way. Mm-hmm. That like, yes, I'm going to play your game and I'm going to get what I want out of you. And I'm going to be okay because I'm smart. And it's like, a lot of times it's like, you're not.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think he absolutely picks up on that. He has a great read on her. And you can see in a scene where she just goes from being terrified to, she kind of sits up straighter in her chair and she starts, throwing out these things. Well, if you don't do this, then we won't do, sort of putting on the FBI agent shtick. And you can just see that he doesn't buy any of it. He knows that she's not, she's just putting on an act. So I think that, that dynamic in the movie is such kind of like a singular thing. Because I was trying to think of a dynamic in like a horror movies or thrillers that is that kind of good and that interesting to just watch. I just love the interplay. And
I can think of other films that have done it. I don't know. I would have to like really like do some, go back and watch a lot more movies to see which ones, are up to this level. I think of, there's the other Lecter films, Manhunter and Red Dragon, which have kind of a similar dynamic, although a more seasoned FBI agent engaging in that. I think of a film like The Hitcher, where, you also have, the character trying to like challenge the protagonist to be more savage, more evil, and more assertive, and there's even elements of it in a film like The Exorcist where, the devil is inside this girl taunting the priests who are trying to save her. Yeah. I love a good mind game. Face Off is another great one, you know, where they're, again, it's so much of it is like they're in each other's heads and they're, you know, it's that kind of like mind game going on between the two of them.
Yeah. And you brought up, you know, doing it at a certain level, this performance. What do you make of, you know, this kind of movie at that time, you know, before we had elevated horror, things like that? Because this movie was so celebrated at, you know, at the Oscars, and, you know, I don't know that there was a movie like that before that had been so...
I'm not sure. I mean, I feel like The Exorcist got a bunch of nominations. Yeah. This has actually been a discussion this year, you know, with the film Sinners, about like, you know, how seriously is the Academy willing to take horror as an art form?
Yeah.
And there's part of me that's like, you know, that's not really the point. The like horror should not be interested in Oscars.
Yeah.
But also, it's like I see a lot of films where like I see a performance. Recent example is Hereditary with Toni Collette. It's like one of the great performances of all time. Another transcoded plot line, which I think is handled a bit better than the one in Silence of the Lambs, but very much a snub for that film, in my opinion.
Yeah, I'm always glad to see horror, you know, winning awards. I know that it's not the end all be all. It doesn't make a good movie, but at the same time, I am glad when, you know, we get to see Sinners winning awards and stuff like that, when we get to see horror kind of, you know, in those categories, because I feel like it does kind of get sort of pushed to the side, not thought of as like serious filmmaking. And there are like a lot of great movies and a lot of great stories out there that are, you know, deserve to be, you know, kind of lauded. So we've talked about all of the performances except for, I think, you know, the big one, which is Anthony Hopkins' performance. What do we make of Anthony Hopkins' performance?
Oh gosh, he is just loving. He is just eating up every moment of scenery. He is just having a blast, and you know, it's terrifying because, again, like the way that they film it, so often he's staring right at you, saying the most disarming and like putting you in such a vulnerable situation. But also, like, you know, I once heard I think it was the You Are Good podcast. They talk about Brian Cox's performance as Hannibal Lecter in Manhunter, which is another great one. But like, they called that performance the cunty version. And it's like, I feel like Anthony Hopkins is bringing, you know, he is serving cunt in this movie. Like,
oh, no. You were doing fine. You had been courteous and receptive to courtesy. You had established trust with the embarrassing truth about Miggs. And now this ham-handed segue into your questionnaire. It won't do.
From the moment, you know, Clarice walks in and he's standing behind the glass, just the way he's standing there is so unsettling. You know, it's just such a great performance, and you can just tell he was having such a great time and playing around so much, and so much of it made its way into the movie.
And it's so still. That's the other thing, is like, you know, it's campy and it's over the top, but he's barely moving for most of it, and that's creepy.
Yeah, he's such an imposing figure, and just kind of the way that they chose to sort of have him in kind of the cell, and the way that it was set up. There was that cell, and there was also like the cell that was in the, I guess it was like a state house or something, where he was being sort of kept.
Yeah, it seemed like a gymnasium almost, but
it
was on the 5th floor.
Yeah, I'm not really sure, but I remember that as a kid, that whole sequence really freaked me out. Like, that really scared me, especially where he's just, you know, the blood is just flying up into his face as he's like beating the cop, and for some reason that just stuck with me, as like he's just got so much glee on his face when he's doing it, and it's just so disturbing. And
you also, again, like you understand his character, where it's like, this is somebody who is just not emotionally engaged in life, you know, where like all he can hope for is some sort of minor amusement from fucking with people. And you see that through his relationship with Clarice, but you especially see it when he can play his little chess games, you know, get himself moved to this facility, and then, you know, how am I going to escape past all of these other folks? And it's like, you can see, like, even as he's in the process of eating and beating them to death and cutting off their faces, taking their face off that, you know, he's still kind of bored by the whole situation, but it's like this is the best he can hope for in his life at this point.
And I just found it so much fun that I didn't even remember all of the details of that sequence. And you were like, wait, do you not remember how he actually escapes? And I was like, wait, no, I don't remember. And then it came back to me as we're like, you know, starting to watch it. I'm like, oh, right. He's
I was so disappointed it came back to you because I was so excited to be in the room when you realized, oh, no, he's in the ambulance already.
But again, you know, props to the movie for, you know, I've seen it so many times and it's still, you know, it still can kind of like surprise me. You know, in that way, I can still get lost in the movie in that way.
It's so funny because I was thinking that I would have to like find a way back into this movie, given all of the baggage it has and all of the baggage that the world has around, you know, like the controversy around trans people existing. And right from the start, like I was just all in on the film. I was all in on the filmmaking. It is you know, it's a masterpiece that, again, every time they try to make it about like you know, trans psychology, it just grinds to a halt because it just is so dated in that way and just so dismissive of actual trans people and trans experience.
Right.
And like it's interesting because it's sort of like I am not against there being trans serial killers in movies. Serial killers are great roles and they are fun. You know, we talk about them, how much we like them in these films, and you know, like we enjoy them and they're fun and they're often, you know, an opportunity to kind of explore different parts of the human psyche that you don't get to. And it's like there should be better roles for trans people to play in these films. And I did want to highlight a short film that is kind of like a fan fiction of this and Psycho, where it imagines a T for T relationship between Norman Bates in the film renamed Chloe and Jamie Gum, and it's called Chloe and Jamie. Or Chloe and James, sorry, by Drew Burnett Gregory. It's a very short film. It's but it's like, and, you know, it's about like this toxic relationship between the two of them. I just thought it was very clever, and I would like to see more films like that actually let real trans people explore, you know, these types of stories, but with a sense of lived experience.
Yeah, I agree with you. Obviously, there's room for a lot of improvement in the way the story was told. I don't, however, think that it's, you know, a cancelable, something I'm going to cancel necessarily, like the movie overall. You know, the character and the, you know, I can understand Ted Levine, you know, wanting to say, hey, this was not, you know, I don't really... I don't,
and the thing is, I don't blame Ted Levine for any of it. You know, like I blame Jonathan Demme, who I think is a brilliant director and I think did a brilliant job with this film. And I've seen other films of his that I think are brilliant. And it's really a shame that, you know, he dropped the ball so badly on this part of the story. And I also blame Thomas Harris as well, because that's in the original book.
Yeah. But, you know, I think overall the movie as a piece of filmmaking it's great. It's one of the best, I think, in its genre and of its time. And I think that, you know, it holds up and it's still something that's interesting to have conversations about. And, you know, even talking about the trans, you know, representation in the movie. It's, you know, it's important to have those conversations.
Absolutely.
And, you know, this is something
this is why even bad movies are worthwhile. And even when films are bad, they're worth talking about a lot of the times. It's worth understanding. It's worth picking apart. You know, that's why we're here. That's why we do what we do.
And I think, you know, art is not necessarily like doesn't necessarily need to be this sort of static thing. It's something that is kind of like living and breathing as we're informed by the world changing around us and as we change as people. And that's kind of what we're doing here, rewatching these movies and going back and seeing, you know, how is my experience different now than it was 20 years ago when I first saw it. And I think it's a worthwhile conversation. You know, I think it's something interesting to talk about.
And the experience that we have now doesn't necessarily invalidate the experiences that we had before. It's just that we're coming at it through a different lens from different experiences. And all of it's worthwhile. And sometimes you had to go through we were talking about like films like Reservoir Dogs and Let
Right.
Me In, and it's like, these are films that for us did not hold up anymore. And, I had to go through my Tarantino phase to get to the point where I can say, Reservoir Dogs is actually not as good as I remember.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's important to sort of ask yourself, if this was a formative movie for me, why? And
Yeah.
is it still the same kind of thing? And, what do I feel now when I watch it? So,
Yeah, what if I had seen Paris is Burning at the age that I encountered Silence of the Lambs?
Yeah.
Would I have even been ready for it? I don't know.
Yeah.
So with that in mind, Silence of the Lambs, stay or go?
I say that it stays.
I say so too. I think that we're putting it in the well in the cellar, and we're keeping it there, and maybe we'll skin it later.
Yeah.
So now another question for you is, what do we have on the docket for the next episode?
Well, we're going to be delving into our first film by your favorite director, Steven Spielberg.
One of my
and
favorite directors.
One
but
of your favorite directors.
Definitely like up there.
He's up there for you. And that is the 1999 movie Saving Private Ryan.
I'm very intrigued to know what you're going to make of that film.
So am I. So that's all we have for you this week, and we will catch you next time on
DVD Clutter.
Fletcher's missing an arm.
Man's a raving maniac. Who knows what he'll do?